Clelia, for inviting me to chair this session. Thank you all for coming today. We have a very interesting lineup of three very interesting and I guess in many ways connected talks. So let's just start. And we have about, the talks will be of about 30 minutes each speaker, plus 15 minutes a session of Q&A. And I hope that everyone will prepare himself or herself with interesting questions for a lively discussion. So let me start by introducing the first speaker, Dr. Stephen Clucas from Birkbeck University of London. He is a British Academy postdoctoral fellow at the University, at the University of Sheffield, and he has been working after a PhD at the University of Kent at Canterbury, and he works on the mathematical works in the British tradition, which is a very interesting and now many people working in that nowadays. So the contributions, additional contributions are always welcome. He has been involved in the edition of Thomas Hobbes' De Corpore, and has many other publications related to John Dee, William Sylvius, and others of the same British context. He also is in the board of several organizations and journals, and his talk today will be on John Dee's contribution, and the exact title is Beyond the Preface, John Dee's Contributions to Billingsley's Euclid. So please, Stephen, we are looking forward for your talk.
Thanks so much for your introduction, Leo. And you may be relieved to know we'll be mostly talking about French mathematical culture. let me share my screen with you first. That was a surprise, wasn't it? Okay, let me just get a presentation mode going. Okay, can everyone see my presentation?
Yes.
Good. I'm just now trying to see. Oh, yes, it should be. Yeah, okay. All right. In a list of his books and treatises published in his Letter Apologetical of 1592, the Elizabethan mathematician John Dee provided separate entries on his contributions to Henry Billingsley's English translation of Euclid, published in 1570. In addition to the preface itself, he also mentions my diverse and many annotations and inventions mathematical added in sundry places of the aforesaid English Euclid after the 10th book of the same, anno 1570. Whilst Dee's mathematical preface has garnered a great deal of scholarly attention, far less has been said about his other contributions to Henry Billingsley's English translation of Euclid and their significance for the history of mathematics. This paper provides a review of Dee's contribution to Billingsley's Euclid and reflects on their significance for our understanding of Dee's status as a mathematician and Dee and Billingsley's philosophy of mathematics and their use of 16th century Euclidean scholarship in producing the translation. Although it's been argued on the basis of the surviving copies of Euclid owned by Billingsley that he did not translate directly from the Greek, it is clear that both Dee and Billingsley considered it vitally important to understand the original Greek in order to understand Euclid's ideas. In the argument of Book 15, Billingsley notes that surviving Greek manuscripts contained only 5 propositions, making it likely that the extra material included in earlier translations, most notably that of the influential 14th century translator Campanus of Novara, came from later writers. The problem with Campanus, Billingsley says, is that he was brought up in a time of rudeness when all good letters were darkened and barbarousness had overthrown and overwhelmed the whole world. And thus, he was utterly rude and ignorant in the Greek tongue, so that certainly he never read Euclid in the Greek, nor, of like, translated out of the Greek, but had it translated out of the Arabic tongue. While Billingsley was full of praise for Arabic scholarship, nonetheless, he emphasizes that what they passed on to the Latin West was not from the first fountain of the Greek tongue, and observes that Arabic scholars were accustomed to adding materials to the work which they translated. And Billingsley speculates that it was from an Arabic work of this kind that Campanus received propositions which were not present in the original Greek manuscripts. The same is true of the other books of the Elements, he says, and the reader will find many propositions added, many inverted, and out of order far otherwise than they were placed in the Greek exemplars. Even the modern mathematician Franciscus Frusatus, Francois Dufoy, a diligent restorer of Euclid, had added his own material, and as these additions were singular and witty, Billingsley included them in his edition. The 16th century Euclidean tradition, as Angela Axworthy has recently observed, represents a context of transition between the pre- and early modern period in the Western history of mathematics, with regard to the reception and reassessment of ancient Greek mathematical culture and practice. In what follows, we will see that the re-encounter of the Greek Euclid and the French Euclidean tradition charted by Axworthy was to have a significant impact on the D. Billingsley Euclid translation project in 1570. So how did Dee become involved in Billingsley's translation? When we read Dee's retrospective summary of his career achievements, the so-called Compendious Rehearsal, a manuscript written for a visitation by royal commissioners in 1592, we can see that Euclid and the French mathematical milieu of the mid-16th century play a significant role. Dee sought the recognition of European scholars, and especially mathematical scholars, throughout his career. From his close friendship with Gerard Mercator and Gemma Frisius in Louvain in the 1540s, and his correspondence with the Portuguese mathematician Pedro Nunes in the 1550s, to his collaboration with Federico Comendino in Urbino in 1563 and beyond. He was, however, particularly proud of his reception in Paris in 1550. Dee gave some lectures at the Collège de Reims in the Rue de Sept-Voies at the request of some English gentlemen, allowing for the rosy spectacles of retrospection and the financial motivations behind the presentation of his curriculum vitae. Dee does seem to have made quite an impact on his French audience. Where I did undertake to read freely and publicly Euclid's Elements geometrical, mathematici, physici et Pythagorici, a thing never done publicly in any university of Christendom. My auditory in Reims College was so great and the most part elder than myself that the mathematical schools could not hold them, for many were fain, without the schools, at the windows, to be auditores et spectatores, as they best could help themselves thereto. He also describes the aftermath of his lectures, which he says resulted in correspondence with many French mathematicians, who were, he says, desirous of his acquaintance and conference, including Laurence Fine, professor of mathematics at the Collège Royal, the royal librarian Pierre Mondoré, Petrus Montoreus, who published a commentary on Book 10 of Euclid's Elements in 1551, the astronomer Antoine Mizaut, Johannes Magnianus, the notorious reformer Petrus Ramus, and his gifted student Johannes Apena. To substantiate this claim, Dee directed the commissioners to a table on which he had placed the relevant correspondence with his French colleagues. We can see something of the impact of this Parisian milieu on Dee's conception of mathematics by examining his annotations in a copy of the 1557 Greek-Latin edition of Euclid, published by the assistant of Johannes Magnianus, Stephanus Gracilis, which, according to Dee's inscription on the title page, he had brought in London in August 1558, 8 years after his lectures on Euclid in Paris. In his preface to Billingsley's Euclid in 1570, Dee argued that the word geometry was an incorrect designation for the mathematical discipline which goes by that name. In antiquity, Dee says, the name was used to designate land measuring because of the practical application of mathematical rules to this end. But, Dee says, we can clearly see that Euclid's Elements is about far more than this. Another name, therefore, must needs be had, he said, for our mathematical science of magnitudes, which regardeth neither clod nor turf, neither hill nor dale, neither earth nor heaven, but is absolute megathologia, not creeping on ground, but lifting the heart above the heavens by invisible lines and immortal beams, meeteth with the light incomprehensible, and so procureth joy and perfection unspeakable. Geometry, then, concerns immaterial entities and connects the mind to divine things. Plato, he says, understood the true use of our megethika, or megathologia, and explained it in Book 7 of the Republic, which Dee quotes at length in the Latin translation of Marsilio Ficino. Geometry, Plato says, is the knowledge of that which is everlasting. It will lift up our minds to the verity and prepare our thought to the philosophical love of wisdom and help us to convert ourselves towards heavenly things rather than inferior things. Such megathological contemplations, Dee says, are even more important for Christians and helps them to conceive, discourse and conclude of things intellectual, spiritual, eternal, and such as concern our bliss everlasting. Thus, Dee sees geometry as being best suited to Plato, his fugitive scholars, and he will frame his talk, he says, to that ideal audience. Dee's new name for the discipline transforms geometry from the study of earthly things to a study more akin to theology. The names megethika or megathologia both refer to magnitude from the Greek megathos, and he refers to English in English to our mathematical science of magnitudes, which deals with the absolute immaterial nature of these entities. This idea, however, had been percolating in Dee's mind for some time, because on the front flyleaf of his 1557 Latin and Greek Euclid, we find a note dated the 22nd of May 1559, which anticipates his treatment of megathologia in the 1570 preface. John Dee here desires it to be accepted by learned mathematicians that the same art that until now the whole of antiquity celebrated under the name of geometry be adorned with the name schematics, or rather megathoscopy. This dated statement is followed by an explanation. For the name geometry, he says, then was generally held to mean the measurement of earthly things, which things our pure art does not deal with, but only with intelligible things, dianoeta. It could equally well have been called heaven measuring, uranometria, since geometry is equally concerned with the measurement of the magnitudes and intervals between celestial bodies. Whence, the name of a part of the art is not the name of the whole art. It would be fitting, he says, to think of another word for it. And if that were to be megathoscopy or something like that, the chief end of the art would be donated in the mind of the philosopher considering it. So, as early as 1559, Dee had been considering the need to redefine geometry as the science which considers absolute magnitudes, completely separated from material and sensible things. At this point, his preferred candidates are schematics, by which he presumably means the study of forms and figures, schemata, or megathoscopy, the observation or examination of magnitudes. It is the latter, in fact, which he seems to prefer, as he inserts it as an alternative title, both on the title page and at the head of the Greek text. Although Dee didn't find the word megathoscopia in Gracilis's text, he certainly found support for his position in Gracilis's preface to the work, where Dee underlined the following sentence: "Geometry itself is to be valued for the sake of training cognition, not for some external use, but for the understanding of intelligible things." When Dee lectured on Euclid in Paris in 1550, Mathematici, Physici et Pythagorici, he clearly would have found an audience who shared and understood his Platonic and Pythagorean predilections. And his encounter with French mathematicians was to shape his understanding both of Euclid and of the nature of the mathematical sciences. Although both Billingsley and Dee use the Euclid translation to promote the mechanical uses of mathematics, both of them are committed to the idea of mathematical forms as immaterial and intelligible. Thus, while Billingsley frequently instructs his readers how to construct geometrical figures very readily and mechanically, nonetheless, when he introduces Euclid's initial definitions, he warns his readers, when there is in geometry mention made of points, lines, circles, triangles, or of any other figures, ye may not conceive of them as they be in matter, as in wood, in metal, in paper, or in any such like, but you must conceive them in mind, plucking them by imagination from all matter, so shall you understand them truly and perfectly in their own nature as they are defined. I would like to turn now from the general consideration of mathematical entities to a specific part of the Euclid translation, which benefited from French mathematical scholarship, Dee and Billingsley's approach to Book 10 of the Elements and the whole question of rational and irrational lines. By the end of the 16th century, Book 10 of the Elements had gained a reputation for difficulty. Bartolomeo Zamberti had titled it the Decimus et Difficilimus. Billingsley says that it is the hardest book to understand of all the books of Euclid because of its strange and unaccustomed kinds of demonstration. Many of the well-learned, he says, have much complained of the darkness and difficulty thereof. As well as being difficult, Book 10's treatment of rational and irrational lines was also considered crucially important for understanding Euclid's geometry. These irrational lines and figures, Billingsley says, are the chiefest matter and subject which is entreated of in all this 10th book, the knowledge of which is deep and secret, and pertaineth to the highest and most worthy part of geometry, wherein standeth the pith and marry of the whole science. Billingsley placed particular emphasis on the correct understanding of Euclid's definitions of rational and irrational lines at the beginning of the book. This rational line, he says, is the ground and foundation of all the propositions almost of this whole 10th book, so that unless ye first place this rational line and have a special and continual regard unto it, before you begin any demonstration, ye shall not easily understand it. As it happens, 16th century French mathematicians commenting on this book had questioned the translation choices of earlier Latin versions by returning to the original Greek. While Bartolomeo Zamberti's important 1505 translation had been based on an original Greek text, he had not taken issue with the terms linea rationalis and linea irrationalis. Later French commentators, however, including some of Dee's Parisian contacts, raised some problems about this terminology. In his commentary on the fifth definition, Billingsley shows that he is aware of these French discussions. This first line, so set, whereunto and to whose squares the other lines and their squares are compared, is called a rational line, commonly of the most part of writers. But some there are which mislike that it should be called a rational line, and that not without just cause. In the Greek copy, it is called rete, which signifieth a thing that may be spoken and expressed by word, a thing certain, granted, and appointed. Wherefore, Flusatus, a man who bestowed great travail and diligence in restoring of these elements of Euclid, leaving this word rational, calleth this line supposed and first set a line certain, because the parts thereof into which it is divided are certain and known, and may be expressed by voice, and also be counted by number. Other lines being to this line incommensurable, whose parts are not distinctly known but are uncertain, nor can be expressed by name, nor assigned by number, which are of other men called irrational, he calleth uncertain and third lines. Flusatus, Francois Dufoy, had raised objections to the term linea rationalis in his 1566 edition of Euclid, both in the proemium of Book 10 and in one of his many monitus, addressed to the reader, added to the commentary on the seventh definition. In the proemium, he notes, Euclid, of course, denominates this proposed magnitude, which makes a line, with the word rete, which is properly translated as certain, determinate, and that which can be securely said. In his monitum, Flusatus brings out the difficulties associated with the word. But Campanus and Zamberti translated certain into Latin as rationalem, which is very far from the Greek manuscript, for the Greek uses this word rete, which is more accurately translated as certain, determinate, or manifest, and moreover, certain is more appropriate to this notion than the word rational. Amongst other reasons for rejecting the word rationalis is the association of the Latin word ratio with proportion. It makes no sense to call Euclid's initially posited line rational, Flusatus says, because the single line has no proportion, since proportion, ratio, requires at least two terms. Flusatus thus, as Billingsley observed, uses certa and incerta in his translation instead of rationalis and irrationalis. Flusatus, however, was not the first to raise this issue. As Billingsley notes, Petrus Montoreus doth not very well like of the name. Montoreus, or Pierre Mondore, one of Dee's named Parisian associates, had written a commentary on Book 10 of Euclid's Elements in 1551, a year after Dee was lecturing in Paris. And Dee owned a copy of this work, although it appears not to have survived. Montoreus, who was a royal librarian and a poet as well as a mathematician, was famously or infamously consulted by Petrus Ramus, as he unsuccessfully struggled with the difficulties of Book 10. Montoreus emphasized the crucial importance of the correct understanding of the Greek terms in Euclid's definitions, for, he says, they shed great light on the following propositions. The line that Euclid wanted to call retio, he says, the Latins call rational. For what reason, I don't know. I interpret reton as that which is effable, certain, conceded, and determined. Reton, therefore, will be any line propounded of any magnitude whatever. It's important to pay attention to the simple meaning of the words in Euclid's definitions, Montoreus argues, as they are of the utmost importance for understanding the rest of the book. The line, which I call retio, provides the foundations for almost all of the propositions in these books, and especially those that begin with Book 10. Although Billingsley says that Montoreus, despite his misgivings, retained the term linea rationalis and, unlike Flussatus, altereth it not, but useth it in all his book, which Billingsley invokes in support of his own use of the term rational line, this is not wholly true. Montoreus was sufficiently concerned by the difficulties posed by this term that he retains the original Greek word, adding the phrase id est rationalis to gloss it. Dee was aware of this, and he imports Montoreus's gloss into his copy of the Gracilis Magnianus Euclid, which incorporates Montoreus's translation of Book 10 in toto, but omits the gloss on the Greek term. In addition to registering these concerns with the correct translation of Euclid's definitions, Billingsley also silently paraphrases a passage from Montoreus, where he quotes Niccolo Tartaglia's judgment on Campanis's mistaken views on the relationship between the squares of lines and square numbers, which are, he says, manifestly repugnant to the grounds and principles of Euclid, and constitute the chiefest and greatest cause of the wonderful confusion and darkness of this book. Montoreus, arguably through the influence of Dee, who had a personal connection with him, plays an important role, along with Flussatus, in Billingsley's translation of Book 10, and Billingsley incorporates corollaries, demonstrations, and annotations out of Montoreus's work into the fabric of his own text, and notes a corollary where Montoreus had preempted one added by Flussatus. Although Dee's ostensible contributions to Book 10 amount to the addition of 3 corollaries, some annotations explicating a difficult demonstration, and a lengthy advertisement at the end of the book concerning the misplacement of a proposition, I would argue that Dee was the eminence grise behind Billingsley's handling of Book 10. This can be seen most clearly in a statement which Billingsley makes after his inclusion of a corollary from Flussatus. Although I here note unto you this corollary out of Flussus, yet in very conscious and of grateful mind, I am enforced to certify you that many years before the travails of Flussus upon Euclid's geometrical elements were published, the order how to divide not only the 6 binomial lines into their names, but also how to add to the 6 residuals their due parts, and furthermore to divide all the other irrational lines into parts distinct, of which they are composed, with many other strange conclusions mathematical to the better understanding of this 10th book, were by Master John Dee invented and demonstrated, and as in his book, whose title is Tyrocinium Mathematicum, dedicated to Petrus Nonius, that is Pedro Nunez, anno 1559, may at large appear, which his book, I hope God will one day allow him opportunity to publish with divers others his mathematical and metaphysical labours and inventions. This passage, particularly the phrase grateful mind, which seems to indicate the acknowledgement of a debt of some sort, clearly indicates that Billingsley had benefited from Dee's scholarship on Book 10 in this work, either many years ago, perhaps as a student of Dee, or more recently as a collaborator on the project of translating Euclid into English. I'm tempted to believe that there are traces of Dee's typology of irrational lines in Billingsley's handling of Book 10, and we can certainly see traces of Dee's own intellectual debts to French scholarship in the materials which Billingsley adds to his translation. Billingsley's decision to offer Flussatus's notes rather than Dee's would seem to have been motivated primarily by the fact that Dee himself had plans to publish the work, which was to have introduced, he says, a new art whereby the mathematical sciences greatly may be enriched. Further evidence that Dee had been interested in questions concerning rational and irrational lines in the late 1550s, when the Tirocinium was being composed, can be found in his annotations in the front fly-leaf of his copy of the Gracilis Magnianus Euclid, where he records some notes concerning irrational lines. To conclude, then, the Billingsley Euclid, as its title page advertises, was more than simply a translation, but like the scholarly Euclid translators who preceded them, included certain scholies, annotations, and inventions of the best mathematicians, both of times past and in this our age. Dee and Billingsley were ambivalent about the reformers of Euclid's text. While they complained about Thucydides' cavilling and fault-finding, they nevertheless admired his diligence in restoring of these elements of Euclid. Billingsley presents Dee's redrawing of diagrams in Book 10 as reforming work, which was much better, he says, than those commonly described in other copies, both Greek and Latin. And Dee, in his advertisement at the end of Book 10, argued that through ignorance, arrogancy, and temerity of unskillful method masters, many things remain yet in these geometrical elements unduly tumbled in, though true, yet with disgrace, which by help of so many wits and ability of such as may now have good cause to be skillful therein, will, I hope, ere long be taken away. Dee and Billingsley both aspired to be learned mathematicians, and these aspirations were fed by their acquaintance, both directly and indirectly, with the mathematical culture of mid-16th century France. As their extensive engagement with Thucydides and Montoreus in Book 10 shows us, the English mathematicians emulated and incorporated the work of their learned predecessors. Billingsley's Euclid was enriched through Dee's French connections, and would suggest that Dee's influence over the translation project as a whole should not be assessed on the basis of his acknowledged contributions alone. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stephen. This was a very, very interesting talk.